The Wyoming plains stretched endlessly, golden grasses swaying under the weight of the afternoon wind. Out here, silence wasn't just the absence of noise, it was a presence. A companion that wrapped itself around a man and reminded him daily of what he lacked. For Ethan Calloway, silence had become both his comfort and his burden. The ranch had been in his family for 2 generations, a sturdy spread of land dotted with cattle, a weather-beaten barn, and a modest clapboard house perched against the wide sky. It was good land, hard-working land, and it demanded every ounce of grit from the man who tried to tame it. Ethan had the grit always had, but grit wasn't enough to fill the empty chair at the supper table or answer the little girl's questions when night shadows crept across her bedroom walls. His daughter, Clara, was 7 years old now. Bright-eyed, curious, with hair the color of wheat and sunshine, she was the one joy that kept him pushing through each day. But raising her alone was a task that weighed heavier as the years wore on. Since his wife's passing, Ethan had been both father and mother, teacher and playmate, protector and provider. Some days he managed. Other days he felt as though he was failing her in ways too deep to name. The townsfolk in Cheyenne Ridge had noticed. They were kind enough in their way, but their whispers reached him nonetheless. That Calloway fella, raising a girl all on his own, ain't right. Little Clara needs a woman's hand, a gentle voice in the home. The comments stuck like burrs in Ethan's mind, aggravating him. He didn't need anyone telling him what his daughter lacked. He knew it every time she looked up at him with questions he couldn't answer, or when she clung to him a little longer at night, searching for the softness of a mother's touch that he could never give. Clara never complained, though. She was a resilient child, often skipping around the yard barefoot, humming little tunes she made up herself. She kept a raggedy doll tucked under her arm most days, pretending it was her best friend. But Ethan saw the loneliness in her, the way she sometimes stared out past the fences, as if waiting for someone who never came. It was this ache in Clara's eyes that finally pushed Ethan toward a decision he'd avoided for years. The idea had come from the back of a newspaper, tucked between advertisements for horse tack and cattle auctions, an agency that arranged mail-order brides. It seemed foolish at first, almost insulting, as though companionship could be bought and shipped like a crate of supplies. Ethan had crumpled the paper, tossed it aside. But at night, when the house settled into stillness and he heard Clara's soft breathing from the next room, the idea crept back into his mind. Could he really bring a stranger into their lives? Could he trust someone he'd never met to share his home, his daughter, his heart? He didn't want another heartbreak, not for him, not for Clara. Still, the alternative was worse. He could picture his daughter growing up lonely, starved for affection, carrying a hole in her heart that even his steadfast love couldn't fill. Weeks turned into months, and Ethan wrestled with himself. He asked no one's advice, not even his closest ranch hand, because it wasn't their business. This was about Clara, about her having someone to brush her hair in the mornings, to teach her how to sew, to listen when she whispered the things little girls whispered. One evening, after tucking Clara into bed, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with nothing but a lantern's glow and a sheet of paper. His hand hovered over the page for a long time, pen poised but unmoving. He felt foolish, vulnerable, like a boy writing a school essay. What did a man even say to a woman he hoped would cross the country and step into his life? He scratched out words, rewrote them, and finally settled on a letter that was plain, honest, and without ornament. He told of his ranch, of his daughter, of his need for a wife who was steady and kind. He promised no riches, only hard work and a decent home. His words were stiff, but they carried sincerity. When he folded the letter and sealed it, he felt as though he'd signed more than paper. He'd signed a piece of his pride. Admitting he couldn't do it all alone. Days later, as he rode into town to mail the letter, Clara sat perched on the porch rail, waving goodbye. She thought her father was just handling ranch business, but Ethan knew he was setting in motion something that would change both of their lives forever. As the stagecoach rumbled away carrying his letter, Ethan Calloway felt the heavy silence return around him. But this time, the silence carried a question. Had he just saved his daughter's future or opened their door to heartbreak once again? The train screeched into the small depot at Cheyenne Ridge, steam hissing into the late afternoon air. It was the kind of place where trains didn't linger long, just enough to unload supplies, letters, and the occasional passenger brave enough to step off into a land more dust than comfort. On this day, among the crates and sacks and hurried passengers, a single woman in a plain traveling dress descended the iron steps. Lillian Hayes clutched a worn carpet bag against her chest, her gloved fingers trembling slightly. She was not a fragile woman by nature. Her life in the East had taught her endurance, but there was something daunting about stepping onto soil that felt so foreign, into a life promised only by words scrawled on paper. Her dress, though simple, had been carefully mended in places, the kind of garment that whispered of someone who made do with little. A straw bonnet shielded her auburn hair from the sun, and her eyes, gray and cautious, swept over the station. There was no one here she knew, no familiar anchor to cling to. Only strangers in hats who hurried about, and the wide, restless horizon stretching beyond town. She spotted him then. Ethan Calloway stood apart from the bustle, tall and broad-shouldered, his weathered hat pulled low over eyes that studied her with a careful, almost guarded expression. He wasn't holding flowers or extending a hand of welcome. Instead, he stood like a man appraising a piece of equipment he wasn't certain would hold up to the work. Lillian's heart gave a nervous flutter. This was the man who had written the letter short, plain, but honest. She had carried his words in her pocket, rereading them when fear threatened to send her back east. A man of few words but steady, she had told herself. Now, facing him, she saw the weight in his posture, the kind that came from years of responsibility. "Mrs. Hayes?" His voice was low, even like gravel shifting under boots. She nodded, adjusting her grip on the carpet bag. "Yes, though. It's just Miss for now." Ethan gave the faintest nod as though confirming a fact. "I'm Calloway. Ethan." The moment stretched. Lillian felt 100 things rise in her throat. Introductions, reassurances, little attempts to ease the distance, but none seemed to fit. Ethan stepped forward, taking the carpetbag from her without asking. His hands were rough, calloused, but surprisingly gentle as they lifted the weight from her arms. Behind him, a small figure peeked from the wagon parked by the station. A little girl with wide brown eyes and hair in uneven braids leaned forward. Curious, Clara. Lillian's heart softened instantly. Children had always stirred something in her, though she'd never had any of her own. She lifted a cautious hand in greeting, and the little girl ducked behind the wagon sideboard, only her eyes peeking out like a cautious sparrow. "This is Clara," Ethan said over his shoulder, as though it were explanation enough. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. The wagon creaked under their weight, the horses' hooves drumming a steady rhythm against the dirt road. Lillian sat beside Ethan, clutching her hands in her lap, while Clara perched on the other side, sneaking glances at her when she thought no one was looking. Lillian tried to offer conversation, speaking of the weather, of how vast the land seemed compared to the city streets she had left. Ethan responded in short nods and brief words. He wasn't unkind, just distant, guarded. It was clear he had not brought her here for chatter, but Clara's gaze was different. Shy, yes, but searching too. Lillian smiled softly at her, tilting her head in a way that invited trust. After some time, Clara offered a question, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you know how to make apple pie?" Ethan glanced sideways at his daughter, almost embarrassed by the question. But Lillian's heart lifted. "I do," she said gently. It was my mother's favorite recipe. Clara's eyes widened with something close to hope, and for the first time since stepping off the train, Lillian felt the ground beneath her steady dot as the wagon rolled into the Calloway ranch. Lillian's eyes took in the weathered house, the barn standing tall against the plains, and the endless sweep of land that would now be her world. It was rougher than she'd imagined, lonelier too. But it wasn't emptiness she felt, it was possibility. She didn't know if Ethan wanted her here beyond the arrangement, didn't know if she would ever belong in his heart. But when Clara slipped her small hand into hers as they walked up the porch steps, Lillian realized she had already found a reason worth staying. The future was uncertain, but in the warmth of that child's hand, it no longer felt so frightening. The Calloway Ranch revealed itself to Lillian as both beautiful and unforgiving. The wide plains shimmered under the sun, stretching endlessly until the horizon blurred into sky. There was a rugged poetry in the land, but beneath that beauty lay demands, hard work, blistered hands, and a toughness she had not yet learned. Her first morning began before dawn, the rooster crowing loud enough to rattle the window panes. Lillian woke to a house still half in shadow, the smell of wood smoke lingering from the banked fire. She slipped into her plain work dress, braided her hair tightly, and stepped into the kitchen determined to prove herself useful. Ethan was already there, sleeves rolled, pouring black coffee into a tin mug. He gave her a nod neither unfriendly nor warm, then turned back to the stove. "Plenty to do," he said simply. "Chickens need feed. Water pump's stiff. You'll want to haul before it jams. Clara'll be needing breakfast before her chores." It wasn't a list meant to discourage, but the words landed heavy nonetheless. Lillian took a steadying breath. "You came here to build a life, not to wilt," she reminded herself. The pump nearly bested her that first morning. She pulled, strained, and pushed until her arms ached. Water sputtered reluctantly, splashing across her apron. When she finally filled the pail, it was only half full and sloshing. She carried it back to the house, determined not to show weakness. By the time she set breakfast on the table, biscuits a little too heavy, eggs a little too runny, Ethan's brows drew together. He didn't complain, but the silence between bites said more than words could. Clara, however, smiled politely and ate every crumb, sneaking glances at Lillian as though measuring her efforts. Later that day, Lillian tried her hand at feeding the chickens. She scattered feed unevenly, and the birds flapped and squawked in chaotic circles. Clara laughed from the fence, covering her mouth with small hands. It wasn't cruel laughter, just the bright amusement of a child who knew more than the adult in front of her. "You've got to toss it smooth," Clara instructed, hopping down to show her. She scooped a handful of feed and let it fall in a graceful arc, the chickens rushing to peck at it neatly. "Like this, see?" Lillian knelt beside her, humbled and charmed. "Thank you, Clara. You're a fine teacher." The girl beamed, pride glowing in her face. It was the first crack in the wall between them. Days passed in this way, Lillian stumbling, learning, trying again. She burned bread one morning and undercooked it the next. She misjudged the stubborn mule's temper and nearly ended up with a hoof print on her skirt. Each mistake weighed on her, especially under Ethan's watchful eyes. He rarely scolded, but his silence cut deep, as if he expected her to fail. Yet whenever she faltered, Clara was there. Small hands helping to gather spilled flour, a giggle softening the sting of embarrassment, questions tumbling from her lips as though eager to keep Lillian company. "Where are you from? Do you like dolls? Will you tell me a story tonight?" Lillian found herself saying yes more often than no. At night, after supper dishes were cleared, Clara would tug at her hand and lead her to the small room she slept in. There, Lillian read from a worn book she had carried in her carpet bag. Clara nestled close, eyes wide, soaking in every word. One evening, as Lillian's voice carried through a tale of far-off kingdoms and brave maidens, Ethan lingered in the hallway. He hadn't meant to listen, but the sound of his daughter's giggle stopped him. It had been so long, too long since that sound had filled the house. His chest tightened, torn between gratitude and the sharp reminder that another woman now sat in the place his late wife once had, for Clara, though the shift was seamless. She began trailing after Lillian during the day, carrying a smaller bucket when water needed hauling, gathering eggs with careful hands, brushing flour across the table as though she belonged in the kitchen beside her. She called her Miss Lily in a shy voice that soon grew more confident, as if the name had always been meant for her. Ethan watched all this with a mix of unease and reluctant respect. The woman was unskilled, yes, but she was stubborn. She didn't complain when the sun burned her skin or when blisters formed on her palms. And most importantly, she brought light back into Clara's eyes. Still, at night when Ethan sat alone on the porch, he wondered if he had made a mistake. A mail-order bride was meant to ease his burdens, not add to them. Yet as he glanced back through the window and saw Clara laughing as Lillian tucked her in, he knew one truth already. Whether or not Lillian proved herself as a ranch wife, she had already carved a place in his daughter's heart, and that, more than any chore left undone, was what mattered. The weeks rolled by like wagon wheels on a long trail, steady, sometimes bumpy, yet moving forward. By now, the Calloway Ranch no longer felt entirely foreign to Lillian. She rose with the dawn, her hands red and calloused from endless chores, her skirts often dust-stained by midday. It was hard, unrelenting work, but she no longer shrank from it. Each task she mastered, no matter how small, built a quiet strength inside her. Ethan noticed, though he said little. He watched from the barn doorway as she hung laundry on the line, sleeves rolled to the elbows, hair sticking to her damp forehead. He watched her lead the mule with firm steps, though her muscles trembled with the effort. He even caught himself noticing the calm way she soothed Clara when the child scraped her knee, speaking with patience that seemed to pour balm into wounds deeper than the skin. Still, Ethan kept his distance. He carried the past like a shield, one forged from grief and fear. Loving his late wife had been the deepest wound of his life. Losing her had been the breaking of it. He wasn't sure he could open himself again, not when the risk of loss lingered like a shadow. For Clara, though, hesitation did not exist. She had folded Lillian into her world as easily as a child might slip a doll beneath her blanket. Miss Lily was now her constant companion, and Clara followed her as if tethered by an invisible thread. One morning, as Lillian kneaded dough on the kitchen table, Clara climbed onto a stool beside her. "Can I try?" she asked, pressing her tiny fists into the soft mound. "Of course," Lillian said, guiding her hands gently. "Push down with your palms, then fold it over, just like this." Flour dusted Clara's nose, and she laughed with unrestrained joy. Ethan, stepping in to fetch a tool, paused at the doorway. For a fleeting moment, he was transported years back when his late wife had done the very same with Clara as a baby. The sight pricked something tender in him, something he wanted to turn away from but couldn't. That evening, as the three of them sat at supper, Ethan cleared his throat. "You've picked up more than I expected," he said, nodding toward the bread. It was as close to a compliment as he had given. Lillian offered a small smile. "I'm learning. Ranch life doesn't take kindly to mistakes, but I'm not afraid of work." His gaze lingered on her a moment longer than usual, and she held it without flinching. Something unspoken passed between them before he returned to his meal, but Ethan's guard had not dropped completely. A week later, after Lillian fumbled while harnessing the mule, he muttered, "Maybe this life isn't suited for you." His words were clipped. Not cruel, but they landed like stones. Before Lillian could respond, Clara burst out, tears brimming in her wide eyes. She clutched Lillian's hand fiercely. "Don't say that, Papa. I want her here. I want her to stay. Ethan froze, startled by the force in his daughter's voice. Clara had always been gentle, rarely speaking so boldly. Now she stood trembling but firm, her small frame pressed protectively against Lillian's side. Lillian's own throat tightened. She squeezed Clara's hand, both comforted and astonished by the child's fierce loyalty. Ethan's jaw worked, guilt flashing in his eyes. He hadn't meant to wound Clara. He cleared his throat and turned away, muttering something about needing to check the fence line. But his heart was unsettled, his daughter's tears echoing louder in his mind than any storm. That night, Clara wouldn't go to bed until Lillian read her favorite story twice. She clung tightly to her hand until sleep finally pulled her under. When Lillian stepped into the hall, she found Ethan leaning against the wall, arms folded, eyes shadowed. "I didn't mean." He paused, rubbing the back of his neck. "I forget sometimes she hears more than I think." "She hears everything," Lillian said softly. "Children always do." "And she feels even more." For a long moment, their eyes met in the quiet glow of the lamplight. The air between them felt charged, not with anger but with something fragile, something that might become trust if only either dared to reach for it. Ethan finally nodded, a silent concession. Before retreating down the hall, Lillian leaned against the doorframe, her heart heavy yet hopeful. She hadn't come here expecting love, not from Ethan, not from anyone. But Clara had chosen her, openly and fiercely. And perhaps, just perhaps, that choice might one day soften the hardest heart in the house. Out on the plains, the wind howled through the grasses, as though carrying with it the truth neither Ethan nor Lillian could yet admit. The walls between them were beginning to crack, one small gesture at a time. The morning had dawned bright, but by afternoon the sky turned the color of bruised steel. Out on the plains, storms never crept, they came charging, sweeping down with a fury that rattled fences and bent trees to their roots. Ethan smelled it before he saw it, that sharp tang of ozone in the air. He had been out mending a section of the corral when the first gust hit, whipping his hat from his head. "Storm's coming," he muttered, sprinting back toward the barn. The cattle were restless, lowing nervously, sensing what he already knew. This would be no small squall. By the time he reached the barn, Lillian was already there, her skirt snapping in the wind. Clara clutched against her side. "What can I do?" she shouted over the rising howl. Ethan hesitated only a moment before handing Clara down from Lillian's arms. "Keep her safe inside. I'll handle the rest." But Lillian shook her head fiercely. "No, you can't manage alone. Tell me what to do." Something in her tone brooked no argument. Ethan found himself nodding. "Fine. Help me shore up the barn doors. If they give, the cattle will scatter." The three of them plunged into the chaos together. The wind tore at their clothes, the first sheets of rain lashing down like whips. Ethan strained against the barn doors as they bucked and rattled, his muscles corded with effort. Lillian grabbed a length of rope and tied it across the planks, her fingers raw but steady. Clara huddled near the hay bales, eyes wide, whispering little prayers to herself. Lightning split the sky, followed by a crack of thunder that shook the ground. One of the horses screamed in fear, rearing in its stall. Lillian darted to its side without hesitation, murmuring soothing words, her hand firm on the reins. The animal trembled but stilled under her touch, her calm a balm in the chaos. Ethan caught the moment from the corner of his eye. For a second, he forgot the storm, forgot the danger. He saw only her hair plastered to her face by rain, eyes burning with determination, every movement declaring she would not abandon him or this ranch. Hours seemed to stretch within that storm. They worked side by side, tightening ropes, calming animals, shoring up what the wind tried to tear down. When at last the storm began to ease, the three of them collapsed on the hay-strewn floor of the barn, soaked to the bone and trembling from exhaustion. Clara crawled into Lillian's lap, shivering. Lillian wrapped her arms around the child, pulling her close, rubbing warmth into her small back. Clara clung to her, whispering, "I was so scared, Miss Lily. I thought the roof would blow away." "It didn't," Lillian said softly, pressing her cheek against Clara's damp hair. "Because your papa is strong, and because we stayed together. You're safe now." The little girl nestled deeper into her embrace, finally letting her sobs fall. It was a sound Ethan had heard before, but never soothed Clara, always tucked her fears away for his sake. Now, watching her pour them out into Lillian's arms, he felt something twist inside him. Gratitude, perhaps? Or something even more dangerous, longing. When the rain finally broke into a soft drizzle, they returned to the house, weary but alive. Ethan built a fire while Lillian changed Clara into dry clothes and tucked her into bed. The child wouldn't let go of her hand, holding tight even as her eyes drooped shut. Later, when Clara was finally asleep, Ethan lingered by the fire. Lillian joined him, her hair brushed dry, her cheeks still flushed from the night's ordeal. They sat in silence for a while, the crackle of flames filling the space between them. "You didn't have to stay out there," Ethan said at last. His voice was low, rougher than usual. "You could have gone inside." "I'd have managed." Lillian shook her head. "No, you wouldn't have. Not alone. Not with the animals panicking and the wind tearing at everything. Besides," her eyes softened, her gaze flicking toward the hallway where Clara slept. "She needed to see us stand together. To know she wasn't facing it alone." Ethan's throat tightened. Her words struck something deep, something he had locked away since the day he buried his wife. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. And then, like a small flame sparking in the dark, Clara's sleepy voice drifted from her room. "Papa, can she stay forever?" The innocence of it, the sheer hope in her tone, silenced Ethan completely. He turned toward Lillian, their eyes meeting in the flickering light. For the first time, he allowed himself to truly see her, not as a hired solution, not as a stranger, but as a woman who had stood in the storm with him, who had given his daughter the comfort he could not. Ethan swallowed hard, looking away. He didn't have an answer yet, not when he dared speak. But deep in his chest, something long dormant began to stir. The soft warmth of spring sunlight fell over the ranch, spilling across the meadows where wildflowers began to bloom. Months had passed since the arrival of the mail-order bride, Clara, but in those months, something had changed on the ranch, something deeper than anyone could have imagined. It was no longer just Ethan and his daughter, Lily, surviving day by day on hard work and silence. The house, once filled with echoes and emptiness, now carried the music of laughter, the comfort of voices, and the scent of Clara's cooking that seemed to weave love into every meal. Yet, beneath it all, Ethan still wrestled with his own feelings. He had ordered Clara as a wife, yes, but he had never been the sort of man to believe love could be bought, or that a stranger could fill the gap his late wife had left. What he hadn't expected was the way Clara had stepped not just into his household, but into their lives as though she had always belonged. For Lily, the change was undeniable. She had blossomed like the fields outside, no longer so lonely, no longer carrying the heavy silence of a child who had lost her mother. Clara braided her hair in the mornings, read stories with her at night, and encouraged her to dream again. But Lily also felt a quiet fear growing inside her. She had overheard whispers in town, some saying mail-order brides often left, that they didn't always stay where they were sent. And Lily, with the innocent but sharp heart of a child, worried every day that Clara might one day leave her too. One evening, the little girl could not hold it in any longer. As they sat on the porch watching the sunset spill red and gold across the sky, Lily curled against Clara's side, her small hands clutching tightly at Clara's dress. Her voice trembled when she whispered, "Can you stay forever?" Clara froze for a moment, startled by the depth of the plea. She looked down at the girl, those wide, hopeful eyes glistening with unshed tears, and felt her heart break and mend at the same time. Slowly, she reached out and brushed Lily's hair back. "Forever is a long time, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice tender. "But I promise you this, I'm not going anywhere. Not as long as you want me here." Ethan, who had been standing nearby, had heard every word. His chest tightened as he turned his gaze away from the horizon to Clara and his daughter. In that moment, he realized it wasn't just about the ranch or about fulfilling some practical need for a wife. It was about the life that had been built in the quiet spaces of their days together, the laughter at breakfast, the teamwork during chores, the way Clara hummed softly as she worked, filling the house with a sense of home. He stepped closer, the boards of the porch creaking beneath his boots. "You already are forever," he said quietly, surprising even himself with how easily the words came. "This house, this ranch, it's not complete without you." Clara's eyes widened as she met his gaze, and for a moment the air seemed to still around them. She saw not just a rancher worn down by years of labor and loneliness, but a man who had begun to hope again. The following weeks were filled with celebration, though not the kind that required grand announcements or town gatherings. It was the small things, the way Lily danced through the fields, knowing she was no longer alone. The way Ethan finally allowed himself to smile more freely. The way Clara began tending to the land as though it were hers by right. One afternoon, Lily insisted on a wedding, even if it was just for the three of them. She picked flowers from the meadow, made a little crown for Clara, and tied a ribbon around her father's arm like a band of honor. Standing in front of the little wooden cross near the ranch where her mother had once been laid to rest, Ethan and Clara promised each other not through legal papers or contracts, but with simple, heartfelt vows to be partners, to be family, and to never let Lily feel alone again. The wind rustled the tall grass like a hymn, and the ranch seemed to breathe with life. From that day on, Clara was not just a mail-order bride, not just a stranger brought by a letter and an arrangement. She was wife, mother, and heart of the home. And whenever Lily looked up at Clara, her little hand tucked safely in hers, she smiled with a peace she hadn't known since her mother passed. Because she knew her words had been answered, Clara was there to stay forever.